Okay, so hello everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our final session of what's been a really fantastic series. What we've been trying to do through this webinar series is bring a set of practitioners and academics together to share their insights into employee well-being during the pandemic. And really the emphasis has been to try to really seize the opportunity that has presented itself through the pandemic about the wider interest in employee well-being. Over the series, we've looked at a range of different really interesting topics. So how well-being at work has been affected, various inequalities that have revealed themselves through the pandemic. And in the last session, we looked at the measurement of well-being and the business case for doing so. Now, when we started in June, we probably thought that we'd be perhaps clear of the pandemic by the end, but we're very much still in the middle of it at the moment. Today, really what we want to do with our excellent panel of experts is to reflect a little bit on what really has changed in the last 18 months, 2 years. Think a bit about what we've actually learnt about things like flexible working and remote working, and then consider the challenges that still await us into the future. Now, we're joined by a wonderful panel. So Professor Gail Kinman, Professor Kim Hock, Chief Inspector Steve Kerridge, and we hope at some point Professor Stephen Wood as well.
He's here already, Mike.
He's here, okay, great, fantastic. Unfortunately, Professor Sarah Connolly cannot be with us today. Now, as how we'll run the session, I'll be asking a set of questions to our panelists, but we very much want to encourage questions from the audience. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll find the Q&A box there. So if you do have questions for anyone on this call, please do ask your question in that box, and we'll make sure that gets relayed to the individual. Okay, that's enough from me. So what I would like to do first is to ask an opening question. So to get our panelists to think about what has changed for good in the area of employee well-being during the last 2 years. And I think I'll put that first of all to Steve Kerridge.
Lovely, thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. So just very briefly, Steve Kerridge, I'm the Agile Working Project Manager for Cambridgeshire Constabulary, police officer, seconded to that project. So I think for me, in terms of the positive elements, there's two angles for me. There's been significant learning for the individual and for the employee, which I'll come to in a sec. And then I think there's also some significant well-being benefits in terms of the organisation, what the organisation subsequently reflected on in terms of its employees from there. So I think the most important thing for me really has been around flexibility. It's been around significantly increased discussions around how we work. And I think this has been an additional lens in terms of discussions between staff and managers around how we can deliver our future business, which obviously as a police service is quite broad. We've got a wide range of people. So I think it's been really, really positive. We've obviously started with a really unpleasant thing here. Necessity's been the mother of invention as ever, but really for us, it's very much around starting to form discussions, giving people confidence to come and talk about different ways of working. And I think it's also opened up significantly the discussions around well-being, around mental health, and understanding particularly how the workplace can have an influence on some of those issues. So I think there's an element of that. We've seen significant and we've retained significantly high levels in the workplace. So our absent management has been affected fairly significantly in terms of retaining people in work. And again, there's good and bad in terms of that and understanding some of those elements. So I think that's really, really important in terms of that angle of the business. And I think if we flip it over to the organisation, as I say, and I think we've opened up an additional channel in terms of engagement with our staff. We've got a different front for discussions that affects how we operate. And I think we've seen a lot of the core benefits that a lot of organisations have experienced. Yes, there are negatives as we'll explore, but a lot of the core benefits around productivity that we've seen in most of our areas, which are exceedingly interesting. And I think as an organisation as well, going back to that issue of sort of necessity being the mother of invention, I don't think we would have taken the steps that we've taken and we would have secured some of the benefits that we have now seen over the best part of 2 years if we hadn't been forced down this route in terms of, as I say, that necessity. So lots of benefits, but really for me, it's around engagement, it's around opportunity, and it's around people having greater freedoms and additional fronts in order to talk about what's affecting them in the workplace, how they're feeling, how they can be most productive, and people having a degree of choice in terms of how they deliver the very varied services that we have across our 2,500 or so staff within the Constabulary. So that's my starting position.
Thanks, Steve. Has anyone else got opinions on what's changed in the last couple of years? So, Gail.
I can certainly add to that, I think. Thanks very much, Steve. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of opening up discussions. Certainly in my own work, I've been noticing a much more open culture, in terms of the stigma of talking and having conversations about mental health at work and well-being has seemed to be reduced, but clearly there's more needed there, because it's still stigmatized to some degree in some types of job more than others. But people seem to be better able to talk about their well-being and also their support needs. And I think we've also been more aware of the range of tools and frameworks that can be used, appropriately to find out more about people's needs and how they can be addressed. So I think, putting all these together, I think they've been there for a while, but a lot of us have known about that and how to actually work with organisations to use them. So I think it's really been very useful in terms of giving people tools, to assess well-being and to, put interventions in place that are evidence-based and appropriate to the organisation.
Thank you, Gail. Kim, I don't know whether you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in, Mike. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear, sort of positive stories from Steve, in particular in terms of what's going on in the police service, and Gail as well, the things that you've picked up on as well. I guess my slight concern in terms of a slightly more macro view, in terms of what's been going on in relation to well-being, is some of the evidence we've seen coming out really just in the last few weeks about what's become termed the Great Resignation. I think it was actually a Randstad survey that was run last month that suggested that something like 24% of people are planning to change their job within the next 3 to 6 months. Typically, Randstad have said they would expect a figure of around about 11% over the course of a year. Now, of course, people don't quit their jobs if they're happy, if they've got a high level of well-being. So that does suggest that there are problems going on, and this is going to affect certain sectors that have perennially high hiring difficulties, such as construction, logistics, for example, the tech sector. We know that job vacancies are at a record high at the moment as well, which is going to, and this is all going to add to that sort of problem. So I think the fact that we're seeing all of this going on, the fact that there's so many people saying that they are looking at potentially moving job roles, does suggest that there is a problem of some sort. So I guess in terms of what that might be, I mean, some of it could have been burnout during the pandemic. That wouldn't be, remotely unsurprising. Some of it could be, labour market effects. People tend not to move during recessions because there aren't jobs to move to. So people may have stayed with jobs that they're not particularly happy with. And now that job vacancies are so high, people are now looking to move. But I think on top of this, I mean, the COVID pandemic, it has really highlighted that there's a lot of unfair working practices in Britain. And perhaps people are now saying, we're just not prepared to tolerate these any longer, whether that's bogus freelance work, bogus self-employment, zero-hours contracts, and other forms of insecure employment and so on. So I think there's a sort of broader narrative here around sort of, have there been these shifts in public perceptions in terms of what people are actually prepared to accept in their jobs? And what we're seeing, in a sense, is people actually voting with their feet and saying, well, look, we're not happy. We will be looking to move in the relatively short term as and when we can.
Yeah, very much agree with that, Kim. Thank you. So Kevin, I don't know whether you want to come in at this point, have any additional thoughts or questions?
Oh, Steve's got his hand up, but I also think Stephen probably, I mean, the question is what's changed for good? Maybe we should turn that around and say what's changed for bad. So I think Stephen might have a few thoughts on that. So if we go to Steve first and then we'll go to Stephen, is that okay?
I'm sorry, I can't get my camera to work. I'm on a laptop traveling. Well, I'll ignore the introduction that Kevin's just given me and the implication I'm a negative person, but
no, not at all. I just know you've got some thoughts on that this particular issue. So
I don't know what thoughts, but maybe you just tell me what you think I'm going to say, Kevin. That might be more interesting because I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, some of the issues around home working that you've been.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to make a very different point, really. I think if anything, the good bit, if anything, it's made health and safety and more generally physical health, not just the mental health. There's a danger we get obsessed with mental health, but the physical health is very important, and it's made that much more conscious in there. And hopefully that's the lasting residue of it. And we may see masks being used more frequently as they are in other countries. Hopefully we'll see people being much more conscious of it, because I mean, let's be all conscious. The biggest change for us is we've not had colds. We've not had. I mean, it's just not been. And part of our good well-being during the home working has been that we haven't been ill, even though we haven't been going to health clubs until recently and so on. So for me, that is the biggest change. And on the organisational context, I hope that it actually develops. Puts health and safety much higher up the agenda. And in some sense, I think. If a corollary of what I'm saying is that I hope that what doesn't come out of this is a sort of ghettoization of mental health. And we've got OD specialists in our organisation specialising in mental health and wellbeing programs, which haven't gone down particularly well, and they're not particularly well used because they don't attack the central causes of the stress.
Thank you, Stephen. To Steve Kerridge, before moving on, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I thought that was a really, really interesting point that Kim had raised there. Obviously on the macro scale, I'm just thinking on the micro scale from our organisation, something that is also interesting, that very much relates to that, is the number of staff that we talk to who very much have expressed some kind of interest to move on to something else. But interestingly, what we found, and we talk very openly in our organisation around these things, what we found is for many people, they feel as though some of the caps on their aspiration have been lifted as a result of this. And a lot of people who've been geographically tied to an organisation or an area, and they've capped those aspirations because of various other bits and pieces, are seeing new opportunities now through different ways of working. So it's an interesting one, isn't it, in terms of how we interpret how much of it is around people's dissatisfaction and decide to move, and whether there are those people who are suddenly almost, going into a sweet shop, if you like, and suddenly saying, oh, hang on a minute, actually, I can now reach this shelf and that shelf that I couldn't before. So actually it is for them, and perhaps economically positive in terms of upwards progression and all of those things. But I think that's a really interesting point, and obviously time will tell, but that's just a very brief sort of micro scale sort of view of some of those things we've experienced.
Yeah, can I just come in on that? I think there's, there are going to be different. There will some people for whom that's absolutely the case, that this has kind of broadened their horizons, and there are positives, of the sort that you're describing. The kind of research that I was referring to earlier from Randstad and those types of organisations, they also ask employees why they're looking to quit. And a lot of them are unfortunately giving the negative story, which is that, well, it's low pay, it's to do with poor conditions, it's to do with long working hours, it's to do with stressful jobs, mental health problems and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I guess if you go to look in the round in terms of what's driving this, potential great resignation that we could be on the cusp of seeing, it's more these kind of negative drivers, unfortunately, than the sorts of positive drivers that you're talking about. But I'd also like to add that I think I misinterpreted the question, actually. So Mike, when you said what's changed for good, I thought you meant what's changed forever, right? And of course, you can never tell what's changed forever. I'm not used to being asked what's changed for good, because you just always assume in the academic world that everything's just doom and gloom and it's all worse, and we spend our whole lives telling people how disastrous everything is, and then not coming up with any solutions to those problems problems either. So yeah, sorry, that's just me, my academic interpretation of the question. Everybody else is talking about positives because that's what they're asked to do. I'm talking about negatives because that's just me as a person.
Maybe also because you're a Wolves fan, Kim. Maybe.
Hey.
Well, hang on, we're 6 at the moment, Mike. Come on.
Yeah, hey.
All right.
Good, Mike.
We'll move swiftly on.
The other point, Mike, is that it's only 23%, you know, and some of this movement is residual. You know, people they couldn't move during the pandemic. Secondly, there's a big cost of living problem. I mean, a lot of people are moving and perhaps even taking second jobs because of the cost of living problem. And so I think I'd be wary of and I certainly wouldn't agree with Kim's point about all academics are negative, and certainly not in Leicester, and so on. So I think we have to be really dangerous of generalising from 23%, you know.
Yeah. But Steve, I mean, it is, look, I mean, the figure that Randstad say they would expect, I mean, it's 24% actually in the next 3 to 6 months. Not even over the course of a year. Yeah, what Randstad would say is that they would expect 11% to move over the course of a year. So that's a big difference, right? So, and you're right, some of it is residual from people not having been able to move while the pandemic's going on. But it does, I think, to my mind anyway, suggests that there is a broader sense that coming out of the pandemic, people are maybe looking at their job situation, looking at the labour market more broadly, and not being happy with where they're at. And looking to move on.
So the final positive point is you may get across the economy a better person fit between people, because some of these people they've changed their purposes in life or whatever through the pandemic. So it's all.
Yeah, good thoughts. Thank you, everyone. So one of the things that we can't argue about is that the experience of remote working has increased. The number of people engaged in remote and hybrid work has increased hugely during the pandemic. So I think as an opening question, I think I'll direct this to Gail first of all, is what have we learned from the pandemic about how we can better support well-being and effectiveness at work who are working remotely?
Right. Well, I think we've learned a tremendous amount, and it's popularly called a mass experiment, isn't it, in remote working, because many people didn't have a choice. They were thrown into remote working virtually overnight and had to make the best of it with very little guidance. But we have found out that many more people than was previously thought can work from home in a healthy way and a sustainable way, because before the pandemic, it tended to be the favoured few in organisations. And although working remotely has always been popular, very many people wanted it, but few people actually got it. We also know a lot about the risk factors that can actually destabilize remote working, because we know that it can improve productivity and it can increase well-being. But things like new starters, people that started a new job in the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of work with social work leaders and social workers themselves during the pandemic on supporting remote working, because I'm sure you'd all agree it's a really stressful job. And the people I'm working with are in child support and child protection, which, is even more emotionally demanding and complex. So new starters under these conditions can be difficult because, they don't get the support they need. They're not integrated in a team. And among social workers in particular, having that secure base that you can draw on for support is really, really important. People living alone are also a risk factor. People with caring responsibilities that have to fulfill those. And, again, in relation to social workers and other people doing that type of work, people that work with trauma, because they're not necessarily able to access the support that they would have previously. But the thing is, the interesting thing for me is that some of the widely cited benefits, like the ability to work without distraction from colleagues. I mean, working in an office can be a bit distracting. There's people, there's noise, there's people tapping you on the shoulder asking you for things. So many people say we get a lot more work done, we feel a lot more productive. But we have to look at the reverse side, whereas people say often, okay, well, I do feel very socially isolated as well. So, we need to see the rough and the smooth, I guess. Importantly, too, we know more about the skills and abilities that home workers need to do it in a healthy and sustainable type of way. And in particular, the need for support from colleagues, because that seems to be coming out in so many research projects, interviews, etc., about how important it is. And it's finding ways of actually introducing strategies to sort of emulate the support that you would naturally get at work, which is actually quite difficult. And I've been quite impressed really with the people I've been talking to and the type of strategies that they're using. Including, lots of people are using WhatsApp groups in order to get the more immediate support, perhaps, that they may need after a difficult situation. And also, that I found quite interesting was that some people are using a Zoom call, but not in terms of a meeting, but just to be able to work in a companionable type of way. So you can hear a little bit of background noise, and you are aware that you are co-working with people. So I think we've learned a lot about the creative ways that people can use, to work remotely. And finally, I think we know more about the signs of struggle and how they can actually be detected. People differ obviously in the extent to which they show these signs. It's much more difficult online for people to pick them up. But tools like the Mind Wellness Action Plan can be particularly useful, I think, in identifying the support needs that people may have and the signs and the symptoms that they may show that they're not coping terribly well. So yeah, I think we've learned a lot, certainly, that can be used.
And just follow up with Gail there. I think about having your Zoom or Teams permanently on, and that seems to be a way of replicating that kind of micro breaks you get through natural social interaction. But it also reminds me, I remember going back years now, interviewing some medical device designers, and I remember this quote from the interview, which goes something like, when you actually sat next to the guy you're working with and you can hear what he's swearing about, you know exactly what technical problem he's got, and that helps me understand how to do my work in such a way that reduces that technical problem. Oh, Martin's got his hand up.
Martin, please go ahead.
Yeah, it was really just to sort of, add some personal observations to what Gail has sort of said, because I think, I've certainly detected a little bit of polarization in terms of hybrid working within our workplace. So there are some of our staff who, in the Ministry of Defence, they have to go into offices to use particular IT systems. And so we found that people who work crises, right through the pandemic, had to make their way, using public transport into London or their places of work. They had to sort of, navigate their way around, an organisation that was, just trying to work out, how to safely navigate through COVID. So there was a group of our staff who we've pretty much required to continue to, do office basing throughout the pandemic. And that is a group where, we have noticed higher rates of anxiety because they've had to travel, they've had to sort of navigate the uncertainty. On the flip side of that, there are staff, and I'm thinking mainly about people in the HR area or areas that are not involved in crisis working, where hybrid working actually works really well for them. And I'm one of them. So, I very rarely have to sort of, go to an office at the moment. And so we've actually noticed the emergence almost of two groupings within the organisation, those for whom hybrid working seems to actually, fit really quite well, and others where they have to go into offices, and as a result of that, I think the wellbeing challenges for that particular group are actually heightened as a result. Over.
Yeah, I think Stephen's got his hand up, Mike.
Yeah, please, Stephen.
Our research, which has been in universities, echoes a lot of what Gail said, and of course, in the way she described things, is you've got quite a lot of diversity And I think the general conclusion that people are drawing is that it's worked. We've shown that home working can work, and obviously that one of the riders is we just don't know whether line management really are trusting people, which was one of the reasons why we wasn't very widespread before. But leaving that aside, I think there's things we can't conclude yet. The first one is this effect on people's careers, which was a well-known problem for home workers in the past, or as it was found in the research in the USA, and we just don't know whether it's affected people's careers. The other thing I think that we don't really know is whether hybrid is such a wonderful, the best of both worlds, because, and I particularly have in mind here when you start using hot desking, and I can imagine a situation where a hot desker's attitudes are much more like home workers and feeling isolated, even though they're going into the organisation, and less like the person who goes in 5 days a week, if you sort of mean. So you have three groups. There's the hot deskers, there's the permanent home worker, and the ordinary worker who goes in on site 5 days a week. And I think the hot deskers might end up very much like the lonely, as like the lonely home workers that Gail mentioned. So isolation is a big issue. Loneliness is a result of isolation. It's not the same thing. And we should take lessons. And if something comes out of this, then this is important, because we have isolated part-time workers. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Certainly in universities, they don't tend to be sitting on committees and so on, that sort of thing. And part-time workers have always been isolated, and so, partly because of the fact, because it's compounded by their being predominantly women, and therefore we know women tend to be isolated in a small eye in the past and so on. So I think those are 2 points. But I think the other point we haven't mentioned, I should have mentioned at the beginning, was, and go, I think it's not so much that people have actually clarified their views about home working, so you get some surprising people who, you get the new converts who say, I never thought I could work at home, and now I love it, and I never want to go back. I want 5 days a week at home. And then you get the surprising people who say, no, I definitely don't like home working. And they're surprising because a lot of these are women with children, and they use going to work, the physical distance, the physical differences, as being the way they segment their life. So they literally say, the minute I get in my car to go to work, I'm at work. The minute I get out of it at night, I'm at home, and I take my clothes off. And they literally do talk like this. I change my clothes and things like this. And I find it the distraction of the children and so on. So I want to go back to work. I can't wait to go back to work. So there's some surprising group of people who do. And then there are, of course, people who we're just so used to going to work that they want to carry on, and particularly lab work, people who depend on labs and scientists. We were actually, one of the points, we was quite surprised how low, it wasn't a low figure, but it certainly was nowhere near a majority of how many academics weren't working at all at home before the pandemic. It was the first surprise, in fact, because I just assumed everybody worked at home, but no, not at all. And it's not just the lab workers. Some people just want to. Some guy gave a very nice speech about how he liked to segment. He was more my age, but he said it was a very nice speech about his wife. He liked to respect his wife. He liked to segment his life and so on. And he wasn't working in a lab at all. I like to go to work, and I want to come home and spend my time with my wife and so on and so on. So there's lots of there's diverse people, but as I say, the big message for me is that we just don't know the hybrid's going to be so wonderful. It certainly may not be the happy medium. Sorry, the best of both worlds, I should have said. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I think Gail was first to raise a hand.
Thanks. Yes, I completely agree. And we do have to be very careful, I guess, that what we know about home working during the pandemic isn't mixed up with and conflated with the difficulties that, women may have had in particular in trying to homeschool as well as work, and that is a very unusual situation, isn't it? Looking at these issues beyond the pandemic is obviously needed. So, people were trying to work and trying to care for children and trying to do lots of other things at the same time. And the other point, I picked up to do with hybrid working is that I think one of my concerns is it's often seen as a very easy thing to do. You just say to people, come in whenever. at its sort of easiest, and that does happen. Some organizations I'm aware of, it's like, well, we really don't mind, you come in when you feel you want to come in. But of course, it's not simple, is it? It's not as simple as that. You don't just say that to employees. There needs to be some planning, there needs to be some scheduling, there needs to be some desks available for the employees when they come in. A particular difficulty with the people I'm working with at the moment is that, do you come in on the days that your team are in? And then how do you accommodate people's needs and preferences? Because that may clash. So, you may have the worst of both worlds then. I talked to somebody, an interviewee a couple of weeks ago, and she said that she was desperate to get back to work after about 1.5 years. And, it was her day to go in. She got dressed up, did the full commute and was really excited, got into work, not a soul was there. And, that level of disappointment, she said that she almost cried because she was just looking forward to things being the way they were. And of course, that probably won't happen. There's also competition for desks as well. We need to be sure that hot desk is COVID secure, which can be an issue too. So I think, it may be sold as an easy option, and people, it's very popular among people, but it does take a lot of thought on how to introduce it and how to evaluate it, and to ensure that it works well, I suppose. And we still don't know a huge amount about that.
Thank you, Gail. Just before going to Kim, can I just remind everyone watching the webinar, if you do have a question, please do ask it in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get that to our panelists. Kim.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on some of the points that have been made, I mean, I guess a lot of the research is actually quite positive around working from home. So if you look at things like job satisfaction or commitment, job control, all of these sorts of things tend to be higher among people working from home than people not working from home. But following up on what Steve said, of course, a lot of the evidence also suggests that it doesn't really. This is, Steve, some of the stuff that you're talking about, sort of separation of home and work. People don't actually report better work-life balance working from home, which is an interesting one in many ways, because you would think that that would be one of the main benefits, because you don't have to worry about commuting time and so on and so forth. But if anything, it's probably time to sort of expands that commuting time becomes work, which then spills over into time that you should really be saying, stop, I am now spending this time with my family and not actually doing it. But also just following up on some of the points that people have raised around the diversity and inclusion implications of working from home. I mean, one of the areas I've researched quite heavily recently has been disabled people in employment. And there's a lot of assumptions, I think, that have been made within government and elsewhere that working from home, well, isn't that great? That's going to be wonderful for disabled people. We see more working from home. This is going to mean more disabled people are going to be able to work, more disabled. That's going to have a way of dealing with the disability employment gap. But again, I'll be a bit cautious with that for some of the reasons that people have raised. The issue of isolation, for example, we know that disabled people typically report greater levels of social isolation than non-disabled people, which of course working from home could exacerbate considerably. There's also problems of out of sight, out of mind. So the sorts of adjustments that you need if you're in the home environment, you may well not get. It may be even more difficult to challenge managers' prejudice around disability because they can't actually see you physically performing your work just as well as everybody else. And hybrid working can be a real problem for disabled people, because you then find yourself in a situation where you need adjustments at home, and you also need adjustments when you go into work, plus the fact that you still have to deal with inaccessible workplaces, inaccessible transport systems on the days when you do need to go in. And of course, a lot of employers, and they say, well, look, we can't give you adjustments in the home environment if we're giving you in the work environment as well. This is just sort of, doubling the costs associated with this. So, there's some real issues here where disabled people are concerned. And the research that I've done on this actually shows that disabled people, against what you might expect, actually, are less likely to work from home than disabled people, which is, like I say, the exact opposite of what you think would be the case if it actually benefits disabled people in any sort of way. But of course, this is also in part driven by the fact that disabled people are less likely to do the sorts of jobs where you can work from home. So, disabled people are less likely to be managers, they're less likely to be in professional positions and so on. And that actually explains a lot of why you get this difference between disabled and non-disabled people in terms of whether they can work from home. So, I think we need to sort of, keep in mind that a lot of the issues around diversity, the diversity implications of working from home are probably more complicated than we might immediately think. And also the fact that working from home is and will always be restricted to certain positions. There'll be an awful lot of jobs that people will not be able to do from home. And a lot of those are jobs that disabled people are doing. And that itself is actually going to create new divides within the workforce between those who can and those who can't.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, everyone. I think that really shows that there is no substitute for research evidence, which often contravenes general assumptions and so on. Okay, so I'd like to just move things on a little bit and really broaden out from remote working, hybrid working to just well-being within organizations. So I'm going to ask the question, where should the responsibility of well-being sit within an organization? And I don't know whether particularly the practitioners on the call have a particular view on that. So Steve and Martin.
Well, I can start off if you like, because I mean, we do use a structured approach, and I think you can talk about top down or bottom up, but well-being's it's a team sport, and I think unless you actually get all the stakeholders involved in it within an organisation, you're setting it up to fail. So I mean, the model we use is heavily based on the ACAS mental health model, which is essentially sort of 3 interconnecting circles, and it really just looks at the sort of activity that you can do within every individual in the organisation to help them develop the skills and knowledge, to look after their own well-being and the motivation to sort of get into healthy, mentally and physically healthy daily habits. So we look at individual level. We also look at the sort of work that we can do with managers to raise awareness about mental health and well-being issues and improve their confidence, to talk about well-being at the team level. And then at the leadership or the organizational level, what we're looking at is, how you hardwire, well-being promoting policies, procedures, into just the DNA of the organization. So I think taking that structured approach just acknowledges that individuals absolutely have responsibilities to look after themselves. Managers, the expectation is that you keep a happy, healthy, fulfilled team, and you have the sort of the knowledge and the awareness to be able to do that effectively. And then also there's that responsibility at the organizational level just to make sure that your well-being programmatics are likely to be effective, and that we've sort of found that taking a structured evidence-based approach is probably the best way to do that. I mean, one of the negative things I have noticed throughout COVID is that we had a busy well-being industry before COVID. It's exploded afterwards because of the demand from workplaces, and there are some really good offers out there, and there's also some quite dodgy ones as well. So I think taking that evidence-based approach at least assures organizations that the interventions that they make have been tried in the past, and that there is at least some evidence that they do work. But I think for any organization, a degree of experimentation is always going to be required, and that has to involve individuals, managers and leaders.
Thank you, Martin. Steve, I don't know whether you want to add anything there.
Yeah, it's very, very similar situation to that's just described by Martin, really. So I think pre-COVID, we, as an organisation, I can't speak for the whole police service, but as an organisation, as part of our Triforce area with Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire, so the 3 counties together, we have for a long time had an expectation that there is personal responsibility for well-being, and we try to support that as far as possible. So our personal development review process, our managerial, our supervisory reviews will always have a well-being component built into them. And as we progress through the ranks or through the organisation vertically, there is an expectation in all of our promotion boards, all of our development pieces of work, that there is always going to be a wellbeing angle. So there is an expectation from our successful managers, as well as having the traditional kind of performance culture that we have as a police service, whether you see that as for good or for ill. There also has to be really good, solid evidence of what people are doing to develop others in terms of their well-being, what they're doing to support others in different ways. So that's a really good place for us to be. So bottom to top, I think we're in a pretty good position now. And I think that, again, that shows in lots of the outputs that we have seen, some of those hard measures that we potentially collect around this area of business. I think the other thing that I would flag up, which is interesting as well, and this just applies to us as a group of 3 constabularies, albeit when taken together quite large within the entirety of England, is we've actually seen a bit of a break when we talk about formal responsibility. Our human resources and learning development department, which has traditionally always had the wellbeing function, that's actually through COVID been broken out far more. So we now have a Triforce learning and development and HR function that deal with a lot of the traditional elements of policy and procedure and legal compliance, etc., around our people. And then we have a separate, what's called a people and professionalism strand now, that looks very much at well-being, and that brings in lots of elements of occupational health, physical, mental, psychological well-being, etc. And that's also linked very heavily into elements around professional development as well. So we've got that new area has appeared for us and has been broken out. Time will tell whether that's the right thing or we end up going backwards, but I think that's organisationally an interesting thing that's emerged in terms of responsibilities for well-being in the organisation.
Hey, Mike, before you go to Gail, who's got a hand up, there's a couple of questions in the chat which we might have to return, or should return to after Gail's answer the question.
Great, yeah, Gail.
I just wanted to make a couple of very quick points, to be honest. Number one is that I'd like to see a wellbeing risk assessment in relation to organisational change initiatives, because I think that would be very useful, and it is not always done. And in my own research, I found a huge level of change fatigue, which can paralyse people, obviously, and the whole the culture of uncertainty and the uncertain concerns about uncertainty and anxieties, that would certainly help. And secondly, doing a lot of work with the Society of Occupational Medicine, I'd like to see more of a role for occupational health professionals here in terms of prevention, because often they only get to see people when the damage is done, and they really don't have any input into prevention and introducing or taking a part in shaping evidence-based interventions. And I think they're very knowledgeable and could work very well with HR and any other stakeholders there.
Okay, Gail there just reminds me of some work we did with the Society of Occupational Medicine, which they're talking to HR practitioners, saying we want occupational health to be more strategic. So what we'll do is we'll outsource occupational health and tell them to think about our organisation. So there's kind of like terrible contradiction within there. But we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So there's one from Nick Walsh, is how to create a sense of community. So just going back to hybrid working and how, how do you create that sense of community for people who are working remotely? And relatedly, Anna Salisbury asks, in relation to remote working as well, if you need a room of your own to work, that implies sort of class differentiation, and any implications of fear of admitting weaknesses, whether that's in relation to home working or I guess in terms of disabilities, especially hidden disabilities related to, say, mental health or dyslexia or that kind of thing. So I think our panelists can have a wide range of input into those 3 questions. So Stephen and Martin have got their hands up. So can I go first, Stephen?
I was going to make a different point that doesn't relate to these questions. I was just going to make the point that about once we start talking about using professional occupational health people, which is really important. Everything Gail said was right. but we mustn't leave at 2 o'clock without mentioning a whole set of the economy, which Kim said maybe they can't work at home, but well, if you talk about well-being across the economy, it's very important. You just think the people are doing in branches of even big places like Sainsbury's or pubs, for example, all these places where the stress is caused by the job itself and the job demands and the customers that they have to face and so on, and call centers and so on. And therefore, ultimately, the people responsible for stress are people who design jobs, basically. I mean, they're people. Or perhaps the more important point is they don't design jobs; they just leave it, you know. And I was just thinking, sitting there, thinking about in a pub, you know, what happens if some guy's got some mental health problems? Who's going to help him? I just don't know. I mean, there's no vehicle for him or her to do it. That's what I was going to say, but it doesn't really quite. And paradoxically, it does relate to the other point that, yes, of course, pubs, they do create a sense of community. They are work teams. They work quite well together, don't they, often, and so on. So how do you create a sense of community? It's the $1,000 question, isn't it, really? Which every football club, well, Manchester United especially, would like to know how to do it. But I think if you go to, there's a very good paper, I can't remember the author, that makes the distinction. There is we shouldn't conflate, we shouldn't automatically assume that involvement can't be formalized. You know, we can, in fact, that's what the question implies, is searching for some formal methods to create this ether, if you like. And I think formal methods can work then, and they're not the opposite of informal methods. And, you know, I'm a great fan of working parties. You know, I don't mean formal committees. I mean, universities, of course, are the last place that have committees. Of course, I don't think many organise committees anymore, except universities, and not even civil service. But the point of it, you set up working parties, almost contrived working parties, to find issues, and one of them could be homework. You know, and you get representatives of all aspects of the organisation. You get cross-level functions. You don't have it chaired by a man in the hierarchy. And more importantly, they have to report back to something. And secondly, there's an expectation that whatever they recommend will be implemented, unless it's completely off the wall and so on. And therefore, there has to be some kind of budgets involved, I suppose. But there will be an expectation that these things would be. It's very different from the way Boris Johnson operates, for example, and I'm a great believer in these things. You know, just get people involved through formal processes, and not expect, because that's actually interesting points come out of our focus groups. When people talk about I miss the social side, in the old days you'd think, well, that was going to the pub on a Friday night. It's not. There's nothing to do with that. It's not even to do with the water drinking fountain conversations. It's to do with the fact that they're missing collegiality and the way in which we help each other in our work, and they miss the spontaneous conversations. Of course, but these are work-related conversations. It's not the fun of work so much. It's just the social contact, and that's what. I was really impressed once, it's 30, 40 years ago, by this print firm in Bradford. And they saw the opportunity, when everybody else was going bust, to get hold of our MasterCard or equivalent bills that come through our door. And they went to some major bank, I know which it is, I won't say it, and said, we'll do everything for you. We're not just printers, and they had to rejig themselves. And so we'll get everything. We'll get the stuff done and delivered to you, delivered to all your customers. We'll do everything for you. We're a one function. And to do this, they had to spend a lot of time on cross-hierarchical groups, and this is 30, 40 years ago, as you can imagine. And it's stuck in my mind ever since. And you think, well, why don't people do it? Well, they don't do it. They just don't do it, do they?
Thanks, Steve. I think Martin, I think you were next with your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, it was just to address Nicholas Walsh's sort of question about, cultivating that sort of sense of community. And I think certainly in my mind, there's something in there about, line manager skills. I think, one of the things we noticed was that, those line managers who had, good relationships with their team pre-pandemic, good levels of rapport and trust, they seem to have weathered fairly well, because there was no relationship building to do when, everyone went home, because, you had those good relationships already established. I think where managers perhaps had weaker rapport or weaker trust with their teams, I thought, they seem to have struggled a little bit more. And so I think, there is a degree of complexity there in the future. If we are talking about hybrid working patterns, then I do think line manager skill sets need to change. You need to be equally confident talking about mental health and well-being online or, over Zoom or whatever, as you are doing it face to face. I mean, yes, it does raise sort of additional challenges, but I still think there is a skills requirement there if that's the way that we're going to go. And I think the second point I was going to make is around recognition and reward, because I mean, certainly within the civil service, we tend to reward people for the delivery of products and services. We're not so good at rewarding people for, how well they look after their teams, how well they look after their people. And so I think there needs to be a shift of dynamic there. If you want that sense of community, if you really want to sort of get good relationships going in hybrid working environments, you need to start thinking about rewarding managers and leaders for the well-being outcomes that they deliver within their organisation. So, I mean, as an idea for the future, I mean, you look at the Civil Service People Survey, the Armed Forces Continuous Attitudes Survey. We use the 4 ONS subjective well-being questions. How about at some point in the future we actually assess line managers on the well-being outcomes that their team state, through surveys like that. So you've got a line manager, who consistently manages to deliver high rates of life satisfaction, low rates of anxiety, belief that, what people do in their team is worthwhile, then perhaps we should be rewarding that rather than, slave drivers who can crack the whip, deliver a task, but leave that human carnage behind them.
Yeah, good thoughts. Kim.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on, just follow up on some of the things that Steve Wood was saying about, can you do things, can you improve things via formal structures and systems and the design of jobs and so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, I'd strongly agree with that. This goes back to, I think in many ways, what you would, you look at this and you think the job quality angle of this is absolutely inherent. It's absolutely critical. The relationship between these sorts of outcomes of mental well-being, mental health and so on, and jobs that are intrinsically rewarding, jobs that where there's a degree of participation, involvement and so on and so forth, all the sorts of good HRM practices, high involvement management type practices that we teach our students in many ways. I think in many ways these sorts of things are coming to the fore right now. We've got businesses telling us that these issues to do with labour supply and skill shortages and so on are kind of principal business problems that they have right now. Unless they address these problems, and all of these things we're talking about now will cause them labour supply problems unless they deal with them. Unless they sort it out, this is going to be massively costly to them in terms of the growth of their businesses. So, and also going back to the point earlier about who should be responsible for this. This might be an obvious point, but this should be a boardroom level concern. This isn't the sort of thing that the boardroom can just sort of say, oh yeah, well, okay, that we know that's important, so we'll either outsource it, as I think Kevin was saying earlier, or we'll just get a certain division within the organisation to deal with it. Somebody in the boardroom really needs to be taking note of this, because not just because well-being is a nice thing for the organisation to do, but it's actually in the business's interest to do so because of the potential implications of not doing so for its labour supply and skill shortages that it's likely to suffer. And that goes across all of these things to do with the way jobs are designed, the way that people are involved, the way that people are managed, the way that people get to participate in decision making and so on. All of these things can have a huge influence in terms of driving these sorts of things, generating improvements in these sorts of outcomes.
Thank you, Kim. I know we've just got a couple more minutes on the call, so if any of our panelists have something burning they want to say, please do raise your hand. I think just as a final question from me, because this series was really aiming to bring practitioners and academics together, I'd throw it open just for ideas about how we can continue to bring academics and practitioners together in this area of employee wellbeing.
I mean, what the benefits I've had, I've worked with Kevin, for quite a long time now, and he's helped me sort of access, a range of specialists within the academic community. I think one of the issues I think we have in terms of what works in workplaces is that employers don't evaluate. So they'll spend money on a well-being or a mental health intervention. They won't measure before and they won't measure after. So we simply don't know whether, a lot of these interventions actually work or not. So for me, certainly, I think one of the most valuable things that I've had is just the link in with, Kevin and his team, because they helped me with the evaluation. So, we did a mindfulness trial at one of our sort of sites in Cambridgeshire. Linking in through Kevin enabled me to access, the evaluation question set that was used for a trial at the College of Policing. So I think, quite often academics, have fingers in numerous pies. And so, they can actually sort of help you find other people who might be wrestling with similar challenges to you. But what they can also do is actually help you measure whether what you're doing is actually having the required effect or not.
Thank you, Martin. Steve, please.
Yeah, I'd agree 100% with what Martin's just said there. Likewise, supported significantly by academic partners, UEA, not very much amongst those as well with our work. I think the thing for me, speaking positively, I think there's a change in our industry where people start to really see the value, and I think often academia is lumped into a way of thinking within our organisation, which has always been, and there is a really important role for grasping concepts, for grasping long-term implications, thinking as we were discussing before around the macro scale. But it is, that's hugely important, but as well, there's really impactful stuff that can be delivered really, really quickly that can make a difference. And that's what really helps us in our organisation, is being able to have that evidence quickly. The work we did with UAE at the beginning of the UEA, not UAE, obviously, it's like fun there. The work we did with UEA was really, really important within a matter of months to be able to turn around a really good solid evidence base that straight off the bat was then allowed to be put into our case for change, which was really, really important. So I think that's hugely important. And I think just picking up Martin's point as well is around being in for the long haul. So a lot of people in policing will be very interested in, oh yeah, academia, that's great, that can be a help. And they think that it's instantly going to be a quick fix. Something's going to be done and it's going to be finished. So it's that engaged investment. While we can drop things, whilst I've just said we can get things done really, really quickly and we can make changes, particularly around things like evaluation, that's really, really important. We will sometimes get academics in to do that initial piece of work, and actually the really hard work or the interesting bit around how does that take and how do we evaluate, that's the bit that's often missed. So from a leadership perspective in policing, it's showing that long game and keeping that engagement over an extended period to get that done. Fantastic. I'm afraid we're out of time. Sorry, Gail, I can't come to you.
I'm sorry, Kim, because I know Kim's got an interest in connecting this up with government as well. So.
I know, we've just run out of time, I'm afraid. So last thing for me to say is thank you to all of the panelists. Much appreciated your time. Thank you to Marion for organising this call. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Martin. This has been a really great series to be a part of. So, and thank you to the audience. Thank you to everyone. But we'll sign off now.
Thank you as well, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.